Craig here on the third floor doing another painting tutorial. In part one of this series we focused on how to build the model. In part two we focused on how to paint the face makeup of this model. Now we're into part three where we're going to take the Domador Cadaveres female sculpt from Wyrd Miniatures and we're going to be painting a light Caucasian style flesh tone. So we're going to be painting all of the flesh on the arms, the back, and the chest. And the main techniques that you're going to see me use here is how I blend and how I bring up the highlights and bring down the shadows. One of the big challenges that you'll find with painting flesh is that you want contrast because that's what makes a model look good, but you also want it to look organic. So you have to find a nice balance between contrast and blending. You'll see how I use the paint, the thinness of the paint to be able to make those transitions work. I'm going to be using a lot of the same tools that I talked about in part two of this video when we painted the face, including the Artis Opus brushes. But we also got sent a new set of brushes. Our friends over at Gadzooks Gaming sent us their newest set of brushes, which I gotta tell you, they're really good brushes for their price. Maybe the best value I've seen for brushes. So for those of you that want decent brushes that aren't going to cost you an arm and a leg, check them out at their website. Gadzooks puts out a lot of good product. They've supported the Malifaux community well, and it's worth checking out. The other thing that you're going to see me use that you haven't seen before is the Scale 75 Flesh set. This is a set you can buy from Scale 75, and it really allows you to paint just about any type of flesh that you want. I love it for painting a lighter flesh tone. In general, the Scale 75 paints as a paint line are my favorite. The pigment count is very high, and they blend really, really well. The only thing with using Scale 75 paints is you have to shake them. They separate pretty easily, and I recommend putting an agitator ball in there and really shaking those paints to get them mixed well. But once you do, they come off the brush really nice. The other thing that I love about Scale 75 paints is the matte finish that those paints have. I've yet to see another paint line that gives the same finish to the model. Okay, let's jump in and let's learn how to paint Caucasian light skin tones. All right, we've primed the model white, well, gray, and then we did a zenithal highlight along top. So now I want to get a little black lining in. So I'm going to take the Gadzooks finisher brush, and we're going to basically use some ink to give me some definition between the flesh and the other areas. This will also effectively give me kind of a black line to work from. So I'm going to use Kel's Magic Sauce Black, which is, it's another ink. It's no longer available anywhere, but you could use Null Oil or any other kind of wash or ink. And the idea being is we're going to just put a little bit of this wash in between the borders, between the flesh and the other areas. And it's going to do two things for me. One, it's going to make it easier for me to see, where the flesh starts and stops, because sometimes when you prime a light color like the gray and the white that I did here, it can be a little difficult to see the definition between the different parts. These are nice sculpts, so by putting a nice black line using these washes, it's relatively easy for me to define the areas. The second thing this does for me is that it gives me a slight darker area where these areas meet. So for example, here where the sleeve meets the arm, or you saw on her chest where the dress starts and stops, by having some black in there and then later using thinned down paints, some of that black sticks around and it allows me to really kind of define the areas even after it's painted, because a little bit of the black will remain. Here I'm doing it for the hands around the skull. Make sure that those fingers stand out. Make sure we have a little bit of a nice black line between the base of that skull and the palm of the hand. Of course, we got to get the inside of the ear, where the hair is meeting the flesh as well. And we're going to do this twice. We're going to do it for both the model that I'm doing for myself as well as the model I'm doing for my commission. Though we're only ultimately going to paint flesh, this first flesh tone on the first model. Here I'm defining between the back area. She has a bare back, so I'm defining the back area from the flesh to the dress as well. And you'll notice when I paint that I really don't do washes in your traditional senses. So typically what you see when people do washes, we're going to go ahead and do the second one here real quick while we've got it out. Then we're just going to focus on the commission piece first, because that's what's going to get this light Caucasian skin. But you'll notice when I paint that I don't use washes in kind of your traditional manner. When I use washes here just to define areas, to give me that black line effect that I talked about, a lot of times what you'll see washes used for, and there's nothing wrong with this, is, you paint your base color, you wash it, and then build up your highlights, allowing the wash to darken and do your shading for you. It's very fast and very effective. I just don't do that. I tend to do all of my shading with paint versus washes. You oftentimes see people will paint the whole miniature, highlights and everything, and then wash the whole thing. This one I do have a problem with. I think that way you tend to really hurt the quality of the paint job. So you lose a lot of the detail that you've done in your transitions. You tend to have kind of a dirty look to the model. I'm going back here to the first because, and this is something that's nice about painting two models, is I noticed as I was painting the second model, there's a few areas in the first model where I don't think I hit the transition. So I'm going to come back and get the arm and just really make sure now that some of that wash is dried that I'm happy and it's dark enough. And then we'll be moving on to actually putting some paint on here. So we're going to start off with using two colors at the same time, Pink Flesh and Basic Flesh from Scale Color. And I'm going to put them both on the palette. And I'm going to start with mostly the darker color, the Pink Flesh, but you'll see me then introduce Basic Flesh into it. And because I thin my paints down, and not to the point that they're glazes, but they're definitely, not straight out of the pot. There's me putting my flow improver on. That's what I use to mix my paints with, is flow improver. And I tend to mix and go on the spot. So I'm pulling in a little bit of that Pink Flesh and thinning it down with the flow improver. And then what we're going to do is just take really a pure Pink Flesh, and now I'm going to really take advantage of how I primed this model. So I primed the model gray, and then I gave a light dusting of white from the top. Basically a zenithal, that's where the light source is going to be, and you can see that I can tell where the dark areas and the light areas are going to be with that light source being in that direction. So now I'm taking just the pure Pink Flesh and I am sketching in where the darker areas of this model's flesh is going to be. So I'm not painting the whole thing in Pink Flesh. I'm just getting the undersides, the gray, what remained gray after the white priming. And this sketching out of this really kind of helps me understand, even though I'm turning the model in all different directions and turning her sideways as I paint, it reminds me where light is hitting and where light is not hitting. So we're going to go ahead and paint all of the darker areas of my darker color. You'll notice, because of the degree in which I thin my paints, that I have to hit things several times. So I'll hit them once, go to a different area, then come back and hit them again. If I did not thin my paints as much as I did, I wouldn't have to do this. But if you don't thin your paints, you tend to get the chalky look. And I also lose some of the value differences I got from the way I primed the model. And if you get efficient, using 2 thin coats or 3 thin coats doesn't really slow you down that much, because really the first coat, the hardest part is figuring out where you're going to paint. Going back and repainting and putting a second coat on there doesn't take long, because you've already defined the areas. Now eventually, the areas I'm painting in the Pink Flesh right now are going to get darker. So I'm going to be introducing a darker color later, but I want to start building up the highlights first. So essentially I'm going to be base coating it using a combination of these two colors. So I'm still separating the dark from the lights, but you're going to see some of the darker areas get darker than what you're seeing now later on. In fact, it's the last thing I do, is define my darkest darks. So we're still just painting with the pure pink flesh right now. The other thing too is, you'll see that I'm being careful, but I'm not being unbelievably precise in how I'm painting this out, because I'm really defining the value tones more than anything. So much of what I'm painting right now is going to end up getting painted over later as I blend things out and I move things around. So I'm not really super concerned that everything is very precise. That's going to happen as I do my blending and have more paint on my palette to work with. So you can kind of think of this first part as just kind of defining areas, lights and darks. And getting her back now too. You'll notice I won't spend a ton of time on the back, just because it's really not an area that's going to be very visible. But it does need paint on it, so. Now, what I'm doing here, you'll notice it really well here on the chest area, is now I'm starting to push into where a lot of that wash went in. So now I'm turning that wash into more of a darker line. Okay, so now we're going to go ahead and add the basic flesh in there, which is a lighter color. And now we're going to hit the top areas. So places where light is hitting. And you'll notice the contrast is there. You can definitely see when, the difference between, the pure pink flesh versus where I added some of that basic flesh. But the value contrast is not huge. And again, I'm base coating the model. So after I've got it base coated, but still left the areas that I want defined as lights and darks, really so much of how I paint is just building up that contrast and smoothing out that contrast. So I'm painting right to the edges of where I left the pure pink flesh. Trying to leave a distinct line between the two, but covering all of the gray up. And as I bleed over, because of, again, how much I thin my paints, you start to just blend by just bleeding over. So a lot of times when you're putting paint down, it's not as much painting the model as pushing paint around the model, is how I think of it. Is you put the paint on the model and you move it around and get it where it needs to be, with the big understanding. We'll talk about this a little bit more in detail in a moment, but where your brush finishes is where the more paint is going to be left. So as I'm pulling and pushing the paint, like you'll notice as I'm doing these light areas, the direction of my brush strokes matter. So here on the arm, I'm going from the top to the bottom, because the bottom area is going to be brighter than the top. So where I leave my brush is going to have more paint, and paint's going to be pushed to that area, and as a result, I'm going to be building in my transitions. So we're leveraging the paint that I've already put down. We are also taking advantage of the zenithal highlighting I did from the priming. Here I'm putting some flesh around the face makeup. I wanted there to be definitive flesh areas between where the makeup ends and the hair starts. That's going to hopefully sell this more as makeup versus a mask. I will also purposely kind of spill over some of that onto my face makeup painting that I did in the last video, so that it's not a perfect edge. I want it to look like she applied makeup. All right, we're finishing out our use of the basic and pink flesh. Now I'm just going backwards and forwards, building up the contrast. On the lighter areas, I am making areas more light by using more basic flesh. I'll go back if I want to get some more darkness and use that pink flesh. So now we're going to go ahead and switch brushes. So I always clean my brushes after I use them, and I switch to new ones. I use the standard brush cleaner that you can get on anywhere. Every art store has this on Amazon. It takes 2 seconds to clean your brushes, and it will add great life to the brush. So now we're going to bring in some golden skin, which from a tonal difference is tonally similar to basic flesh, but it's a richer color. So it is lighter, but it's richer as well. I could skip this step. But I like the scale 75 golden skin on when I'm doing Caucasian skin, because it really gives it that, I don't know, it's hard to put into words. It gives it that fleshy look. Now I'm not going to completely cover the areas that I did in the basic flesh, but I am going to cover probably 80% of it with this golden skin. And I'm going to do it again in multiple coats, and each coat covers a little bit less than the last coat, so you end up getting kind of a gradation. Again, you'll notice the direction that I paint. I'm pushing the paint and I'm pulling the paint where I want more paint to be. And as I start putting down this golden skin, you can start to really see the contrast building up. I'm going to be a broken record about contrast. That is, when you see a piece that you love, the majority of your initial reaction is going to be to the contrast of the paint job. Now, the quality of the blending, the special techniques used and stuff like that are also part of that reaction, but your initial reaction visually is going to be to the contrast. If something doesn't look good to you, it's not popping for you, then you need to make your lights lighter and your darks darker. You need to build into that contrast. So again, obviously the way the light's going to hit, it's going to hit that elbow pretty hard. It's going to hit the inside of her arm pretty hard. So I'm just taking advantage of that the tonal nature of this paint. It's a little bit lighter, and I'm just defining those areas out. You'll notice again, I'm not completely covering the basic flesh areas, so I get a nice gradation between the two. Always stop. Take a look, figure out where you need to go. You'll see here I'm working back into the basic flesh now. And I'm going to start working on some of those transitions. So there's a couple transitions between the golden skin and the basic flesh. They were a little harsh for me. So by using a thin down glaze of the basic flesh, I just go over the harsh transition. And because it's, again, thin down, it tends to soften that without eliminating that contrast that I've been talking about. So again, you see me going over the same areas, going over them several times. That's where I'm building up the pigment in those areas, making right now, the lighter areas even lighter by adding more and more of a thin down golden. Each time painting a little bit less of the area than the last time I went over it. Stopping, looking at the model from all different angles, figuring out where I may need to doctor things up, but I'm looking pretty good. Now I'm going to switch brushes again, so let's clean this one. And let's go to a little bit of a smaller brush. I'm going to use the micro brush from that Gadzooks set. Now we're going to bring in the next level up, which is the light skin from Scale Color. This is more of a yellowish, brighter color than the golden. It's got a little bit less of the reds and browns in it. And again, we're now going to go to those same light areas, but we're going to leave, 20-30% of the golden skin behind and untouched, but build up the smaller areas to really kind of sell sell the light. Alright, so we're going to hit the elbow here. You see I'm not going as far up as I did with the last color. I'm also slowing down. So as you get higher up on the highlights and down lower on your shading, you need to get more precise. Your strokes are going to be smaller. You're painting a smaller area. So I tend to use a smaller brush, and I tend to slow down. So I'm really transitioning from the sketch style to more precision. I'm almost at the point where I'm just painting a single line at the top of the arm here. Now I still have 2 more levels of highlights I'm going to go. I've got another paint that I'm going to use, and then I'm going to be mixing that last paint with some white. So things are going to get even more precise. But here I'm going to really start defining fingers being different parts of the fingers, different colors, bring out the knuckles. The top of the hand is now, instead of being the same color, is going to show some contrast. Very edge of that elbow, because of the angle of her arm, is going to be getting some light. There's certain areas of the model that are really going to sell your light source and sell your contrast. I think on this model, it's going to be the top of her left arm, and then this upper arm on the inside of her forearm, as well as her elbow. I'm starting to hit the top of the fingers there. And I really need that elbow to end up being nice and bright, as well as the inside of the forearm. And then I need the areas at the very top of that left arm that's palm down to really have the highest highlights, and that's going to kind of sell this paint job. Again, going over places I've already painted with this color, painting a little bit less of that area, being careful about where I start the paint and the brush stroke direction, pushing and pulling paint, making sure my transitions are okay. In a moment, after I get done with really getting this color where I want it to be in the areas as bright as I want them to be with this color, you'll see me work back into the other colors. So now I'm kind of checking and seeing how things look, and we're looking pretty good, probably ready to move over to the pale skin. All right. So this is going to be the last pure scale color I'm going to use. This is the pale skin. It is a a bone flesh. It is very, very light, almost a white, but not quite. And just like I've been saying, we're now going to paint even smaller areas. So I'm painting less surface area, but I am spending more time on it to get it more and more precise. Taking a second to look at the model, figuring out where I'm going to be. So here we're going to start getting real precise at the top of the arm. And it's essentially a cylinder. Here, get the top of that wrist, get the very tip of those knuckles, the tips of the fingers. Part of the light where it's going to hit on the chest. And again, this is that forearm I've been talking about, where I really need some nice contrast to sell this. And then the tip of that elbow on that right arm. Again, you'll see me taking taking my time now, right? Far more deliberate in how I'm painting those areas. So painting less, taking more time. Really want to get the tops of those knuckles and the tips of those fingers contrasted with the black that surrounds them from the ink wash that we did. Another thing you'll notice too is a lot of times when I'm doing something really small, like the fingers, and there's a nice relief, so the sculpt really shows those fingers, I'll often use the side of the brush as opposed to the tip, and just let the fact that the relief area of the fingers are out enough that by using the side of the brush, I'm able to almost like a dry brush, but with not dry, not a dry brush, but the same concept, which is you're hitting the higher relief areas. Contrast on this neck is also going to be somewhat important. It's a very small surface area, but it's a relatively flat surface area. So I need the full transition to exist on that neck, from the darkest darks to the lightest lights. You see me pulling the paint up and down, trying to make sure that the pigment is ending up where I want it to be. And as I'm going through this now, you can really start to see that the transitions are pretty smooth. I'm going to do, a kind of final cleanup here at the end, but, overall, because I've been taking my time as I've been building up these highlights, the transitions are pretty good. Now, the danger is that the transitions get too smooth and you lose the contrast. So that'll be also a final check I do. Here I am kind of blurring the lines between where the face makeup and the face are, again, to try to give it more of a makeup feel. Getting the tips of the ears and the tip of the ear lobe to get some definition. I still have pure black from the wash and the very underside of that ear, so that gives me a nice contrast. All right. So now we're bringing in my secret weapon, which is the titanium white extra opaque from Old Holland. This is my favorite white paint. It has incredible coverage, high pigment count, and we're going to mix this in with the pale flesh. But it's almost a pure white. The titanium has a higher pigment count, so it's going to dominate this. And now we're almost doing little dots. So painting very small areas where I really want there to be a sense of highlight. So I didn't even go down the whole arm there. I'm hitting just the upper parts, putting small little dots here and there, where the light is going to be the most intense. And at first it looks drastic, but it's because you've been staring at the model, you've been painting it. It's really this step, to be honest with you, that is going to sell it. So I'm getting, you notice I hit just the tips of the knuckles, just the tips of the fingers. One of the areas where I want my lightest lights, the very tip of that elbow there. That's a nice area because it's very close to where it gets nice and dark. Very inner part of that forearm, the very tip of that elbow that I've been obsessing about. This is my final highlight. And the last thing that we're going to do is we're going to bring the darks down. I'm pretty happy with the transitions I've built up. So in a moment here, we're going to get that the darker areas darker. So last but not least now, really happy with how the highlights have come around. Now I need to get some of the darker areas much darker. So I'm going to bring in an Artist Opus brush. This is a 00. And I'm going to use the Indian Shadow from Scale. And in the same way I did as I got higher up on the highlights, I painted less area. I'm going to be painting less area as I start working in this Indian Shadow. So I'm bringing in that pink flesh, kind of getting a mix, and as I go I'll be using less pink flesh and more of that Indian Shadow. So now here comes the darkest darks. Good bit of the underside of that hand is really not going to get much light at all, so that's going to get hit pretty good here. Underside of the arm. The edge of where the dress is meeting the back. You'll notice I'm bringing in even a little bit more of the dark flesh there. Now I'm hitting the underside of that forearm where I've built up that light area so strong. I now need to build up the dark there so we see a real strong contrast on that forearm, as well as under this elbow on the right arm. And so I'm laying down this color, and then I'll be going back to the palette to kind of smooth out some of the transitions. But I think you'll notice by darkening these darks that it's really starting to define the paint job. And a lot of times as you're painting, things don't look good until the last bit of paint gets on there. It's amazing how much faith you need as you paint. So here I'm going to start working through some of these transitions from the darks. So I'm bringing in kind of my pink and basic flesh combo here, painting up some of those transitions. This is definitely more of a glaze, so I've got a good bit of the flow improver in there. So it's going to, be somewhat translucent, but it's going to make the transitions a little less harsh. But I don't want to bring up all of these dark areas. I need those dark areas to stay there. I just want the transition to be reasonable. All right, kind of give her a once over. It looks good. Flesh is tough because you want it to have that contrast, but if it has too much contrast, it doesn't look alive. It doesn't look organic. It's why a lot of people struggle more with flesh than they do with clothing or metals. Because there's a balance between, that stark contrast that every paint job needs, but also having it still look like, it's skin and it's organic. And here, this is just doing some final cleanups, making sure I'm happy with all of the transitions. All my paints are still alive on my palette, so it's easy for me to push paint around. All right, overall, not bad.